Hey, what is up guys? So today I want to argue on both sides of the field. I'm going to be arguing that pendulums are really good and they're way overpowered, and also going to be arguing that pendulums suck and they're not going to see any play. Now first off, we all know about the Cliffos. That's going to be the first real pendulum archetype that is going to be really shining through and going to be showing us how powerful the deck can be. So first off, I'm going to go ahead and go over and touch up upon that pendulums are just out of control, just for the sake of, this argument. Now I know in the TCG we haven't really had access to playing them in real life, but technically if you've seen any pendulum based deck, whether it be Scraps or the Cliffos, I would say those are the two most popular versions of pendulum. And there's also the DeeDees that can be argued that it's a pendulum deck, but I'm talking about a deck that only focuses on pendulums. And what's funny is that new Hermit Yokai archetype, that deck has actually been doing well in the OCG, not even using the pendulums in the deck, but that's a topic for another day. But let's go and touch upon how pendulums work and why it's really strong. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory to see why a deck or an archetype that is pendulum-based would be way too out of control. And the thing is, Cliffos is going to be the best example of it, because what they do is they can just spam the board, and not only do they have a bunch of monsters on board, but they all get effects once they're actually tributed. And if you're playing skill drain with them, their effects resolve, off board anyways, because once they're being tributed, kind of like the Hermetic Dragons, once they're tributed, happens off field. So that's going to make the deck very, very strong. Now, it's not necessarily just that they can main deck skill drain, they have been in the OCG and stuff like that. It's more so the idea that I'm going to go ahead and place two cards in these two zones, and then all the cards in my hand can then be special summoned, and that's how pendulums essentially work. Now, the problem with this is that even if you happen to prevent yourself from getting OTK, whether it be through a Gores or a Mirror Force or even a Torrential Tribute. Now, bottomless, that's another story, because that means they won't be coming back. But the problem with pendulums and how they're really, really strong in the game is essentially because after you essentially get rid of everything on your opponent's board, unless of course you're banishing it or sending it back to the deck, you're going to have to deal with it next turn, unless of course you're playing a deck that can OTK your opponent. Now I feel like pendulums are kind of like an all-in, they're almost like a gimmicky deck, almost like a one-trick pony, but essentially with the ability to come back the next turn, because they go face up in the extra deck, as if that mechanic is not confusing enough for a lot of the newer players. Having more than 15 in the extra deck can be something that you can do in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Which there's some cards that can have interaction with how many cards your opponent has in the extra deck, but for the most part, that ability is just really good because they're not in the graveyard. Therefore, maybe your opponent's trying to do something to your pendulums, they won't be able to do anything to them unless, of course, they stop the pendulum. So, another thing that I wanted to briefly mention on as far as the whole pendulum mechanic is you do have to invest a lot of your cards into the whole pendulum archetype. Because let's say, for example, that you're going first. And let's say your deck is only pendulum based, like you can't make any plays unless of course you're going for that pendulum play. Now you're going to have to use minimum 2 cards to actually complete a pendulum scale at the moment. Who knows, maybe in the future there'll be a card that counts as both zones or something like that, but for the most part, as of right now, you're going to need minimum 2 cards. That means if you're going first and you're only playing a deck that completely relies off of pendulums, you're going to have 3 more cards in your hand. Now, I don't know what those 3 cards are. I don't know if those 3 cards will be summonable, but let's say that you happen to go for everything. You're going to go ahead and use all your resources. You throw out everything. Now, let's say that you throw out all the monsters, and let's say that they're also pendulum monsters, and of course you have the 2 cards that you've used to complete your pendulums, and then you have the 3 cards that you've thrown out. Now, the only problem with this is, let's say your opponent goes, and of course, at the moment there's no FTK pendulum deck, which of course in the future this could totally change, but let's say that your opponent just MSTs one of the pendulum zones next turn, and they clear board. You don't have a response, and it really kind of lacks the player interaction. And I feel like this keeps on happening every time we have power creep in the game. There's just less and less interaction with your opponent in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And personally, for me, I don't like that. I like to be able to, play against what my opponent has, not just summon a bunch of monsters, activate Vanity's Emptiness, and say, hey, good game, man. Because it doesn't give, usually, okay, the other player a sense of that, that was a good game, I got outplayed, I could have done something better. When your opponent just goes, oh, I'm going to spam 5 monsters, do you have an answer? Nope, okay, I'm going to do it, just keep on doing it over and over. And that's what I really don't like, and that's why a lot of players will say it's overpowered. Now, for the sake of arguing that they're not overpowered and that they're bad, because a lot of players are like, yo, pendulums suck, you gotta use 2 cards to complete your thing, and then if you get MST'd, you completely lose. And there's a lot of times, if you have played Cliffos, and let's say you happen to go first. Sometimes you open up with too many monsters and you just don't, I mean, very rarely will you have like a scale that you can't use, but let's say for whatever reason you have one card that's the scale of 1 and all the rest are the high scales, and you activate that one low scale, they MST immediately. You have like no plays at certain times, because if you can't complete your Pendulum, whether it be something like Dark Samorg is on board, or that new card, I forgot what is it. There's another new card that stops Pendulums. There's also Anti-Spell Fragrance. That's more of a side deck card. But there's another card that you can stop Pendulums with, whether it be... There's one that you can activate from your hand. It's a trap card for the opponent controls like two or more spells and you control none. You can activate it from your hand. And then that's like an MST on your opponent's turn, which is kind of nice, being able to just, get rid of cards. But if your opponent like just stops the Pendulum scale... and sometimes they might hit the wrong scale. They might hit the one that you have multiple copies of, and then you're like, I could care less. But if they hit the one that you only have one copy of, sometimes you just can't respond, and you can't even play your deck. If your deck is solely Pendulum based, then you're going to have a lot of problems. And a lot of decks at the moment, there's not that many searching. Of course, the Cliffos, I understand that deck is going to be very strong. But I'm saying other than the Cliffos, like if you look at the Time Gazer and Stargazer Magician, at the moment no one's really playing and doing well at tournaments with these like generic ones. Because I would say those are the most generic ones. There's also Eyes, which allows you to search, but of course you have the Summoner's Art, which is just much stronger in the game. Now I feel like with Pendulums, they can only really get better because they're going to keep on releasing more support for the newer thing that they're trying to introduce into the game. And that's not to say that that's a bad idea, because if you're introducing something new into the game, it's got to be strong in order for players to actually want to play it. Because they released Pendulums and they were completely trash, no one would play them. At the moment, I mean, a lot of players would argue that they're trash. As of right now, meaning that the Cliff Forts are not legal for play right now. And in physical form, I mean, there's not really any Pendulum decks that are really doing anything in the game as far as competitively goes. But I feel like the whole Pendulum mechanic is just kind of poorly designed, simply because it invests everything into one big play at the moment. I mean, pretty much most Pendulum decks invest everything in one play, and if it gets bottomless, you basically have lost. Like, if you're going for your Pendulum play and you're going for your spam all of the monsters that you have in your hand, the two other cards that you have are going to be the cards that you use to essentially bring out your cards. And if everything gets bottomless, what do you do from there? Very few decks can top deck after they've invested, let's say, 3 summonable monsters, and of course the 2 cards that they use to actually Pendulum if they get bottomless. So I think that's definitely a huge problem in the game for Pendulums, and that's just my take on it, because I know a lot of you guys are like, I don't want to ever play Pendulums, but there were people like that when Synchros came out, when XYZs came out. They were like, they're really not wanting to try out the newer stuff, and if you don't try newer stuff out, how are you going to learn how to counter it and how it actually loses? Because the Pendulums, they have times where you can brick, a lot of times actually. If you play a lot of Pendulum decks, which I've tried so many different Pendulum decks, and Cliff Forts, because of the searchability that the deck has, it's just really, really consistent. And one problem I think that Pendulums will have is during the side deck, MST is just going to completely wreck the deck, because I activate this, okay, MST, and then you can't complete your scale, therefore you can't go for any plays, and everything that you use in your deck, because of the 2 things that you'll be required just to even get out your plays, they're already going to be on board, and then if your opponent, wrecks those, you're just going to have a bad time. And against the Cliffworth matchup, Exciton Knight can definitely do a lot of damage, just because, again, it clears the entire board, and they usually get +1 off tool anyways. But that's my take on Pendulums, because a lot of you guys wanted my opinion, wanted to know if I thought it was really broken or if I thought it was really bad. The thing is, I feel like once Pendulums become good, it's just they're going to be too out of control, because you have to have free searchability in order for the deck to be really consistent. And if you have free searchability and the ability to just throw a bunch of monsters, that's, in my opinion, that's a little bit overpowered. Not to say that they can't release something that, completely counters Pendulums, which there's that one card, like I said, it's a card where if your opponent has like 2 or more spell and trap and you control none, you can activate it from your hand during your opponent's turn. So I think that will definitely help out in the side deck. But the problem is, against something like a, the new Apocalypse Killer is now called the Cliffworth Tower, I believe. But anyways, that card, once that comes out, it doesn't matter what you've drawn. Most decks can completely fold against that. But there is the E-Heroes decks, which have been actually side decking Excalibur in the OCG just to match up against that. But That's my take on it, basically, is that it's just a inherently poorly designed mechanic because it makes it so you use too many of your resources, and if it works, I guess you win, and if you, don't get it, then you completely lose, and it really lacks the player interaction. I want there to be at least like 10 turns in a duel. I don't think that that's between, going first, second. I don't think that that's very difficult to ask for the game to actually make it so both players can actually feel like they're getting a few turns in. It's not just like, I summon all my monsters, I attack, give me a force, okay, next turn I'm coming back, attack for game. So that's my take on it. But anyways, thanks for watching, guys, and let me know what are your thoughts on the Pendulum mechanic in the game. Not necessarily just the decks, but the whole idea of I'm going to special summon as many monsters as I want, as long as I have my scale, and the monsters are in between the scale. And let me know if you think it's overpowered or if you think it's just garbage and MST completely wrecks it, which is actually kind of true. I mean, if you're able to completely stop them from actually being able to play their Pendulum. Basically, being able to stop spells can actually hurt them a lot because, it can't complete the scale. Anti-spell fragrance, like you throw anti-spell fragrance, a lot of them don't even main deck MST because they're so reliant on just getting out all their monsters, like I mentioned before. Like, they're not going to have very much back row unless it's, of course, something that's running like skill drain, like the Cliff Hordes. But anyways, thanks for watching, guys. Azneyes signing out.